Okay, we are
Okay,
recording.
so
Go ahead.
hello and welcome. Yeah, so this is going to be a session about using the tidyr and the gather and spread functions and comparing them to the newer pivot longer, pivot wider functions. And I did want to say quickly that I'm going to kind of rush through this because Maro and I are trying to stick to this idea of having the presentation being about 15 minutes and then leaving about 10 minutes to like ask questions and have discussion, because we think that's an important part of this format. And then hopefully still having 5 minutes to take a break or go to the bathroom or do whatever you need to do before the the next meeting starts. So I'm going to try to stick to that, which means I might kind of race through this, and also means like the content might be not super mind-blowing, but we'll see if I can get through something interesting. So, so the background to this is tidyr has been changing. Well, all the tidyverse has been changing a lot recently, and specifically tidyr. These functions that are kind of like the core of tidyr, the gather and spread functions, have now been replaced with these newer functions called pivot longer and pivot wider. And although I say replaced, at least as I understand it, gather and spread are going to stick around for a long time. Like they're not even soft deprecated. Yes, they are advising that you use, or they're strongly, supporting using the newer pivot longer and pivot wider functions. But as far as I understand, the gather and spread functions are going to continue to be in the package for the foreseeable future. And with that in mind, like I actually like gather and spread. I think they're pretty easy to use. I know that not everyone feels that way, so I'm kind of interested to hear what other people think about that in the discussion, whether they thought.
You muted.
So that's the general thing I wanted to go over today. So I'm basically going to use one built-in data set, this billboard data set. And then I'm going to do some things in gather, that how I would do it in gather or possible ways, and then kind of do the same thing in pivot longer, and then show you kind of some new things you can do with pivot longer that you can't do with gather. And then likewise with spread, I'll do some spread and then do the pivot wider and show some of the new things you can do with that. So I'm using this billboard as an example data set, which is basically has an artist, a track, the date that it entered the billboards, and then all of these columns, week 1 through week 76, with what the rank of that line was during that week. And this is a typical kind of form of data set that you might find. And one thing that you might want to do is you might rather have one column with the value of the rank, and then another column saying which week it is in. And this would be the long version of what it now is a wide version. So the way gather works is the first argument is the data, which normally comes in through the dplyr chain that you're in. And then the first argument is the key. And this is the name of the column that you want to put the key into once you've gathered the columns. And then the value argument is the name of the column you want the values to end up in. And then the ... after that allows it to capture any of the column names that you specify. And then there's some additional options. So if we wanted to gather all of these weeks into 2 columns, just which week it is and what the value was in that week. Sort of by default, you would have to list all of those weeks, which is really tedious, especially in this case when you have 76. But essentially it would look like this: week 1, week 2, week 3, and then you would continue naming them. And we can do that, but we don't actually get what we want because all of these weeks, we still have to specify them. But for instance, it should look like this output here. So this is very possible if you only have a few columns that you want to gather. It's very feasible to input them separately like this. But in a lot of cases, that's not super feasible, so you have to find another way. So the first thing I kind of wanted to demonstrate is how you can select these columns. And gather, along with like many of the tidyverse functions, have numerous ways that you're allowed to select the columns. One of them, for gather at least, is to explicitly state each one separately. Another way is you can put the number of the column. So this 4 through n column should give us all these numbers, which are the index of the column names. So this should actually collect all of those weeks into key and value. You can also like negatively select columns. So if we look at the Billboard thing, we have all these week columns, but then there's only these 3 in the beginning that we do not want to gather. So you can sort of select all of the week columns by deselecting all the columns we don't want. So I find myself doing this frequently because it's sometimes easier to specify the columns that you want to not gather than the ones that you do. So this also works. You can also negatively specify the column indexes. So I said columns 1 through 3, but don't use them. So that kind of has the same kind of effect. And then you can also have this syntax where you specify the start column and then an end column, and then it automatically selects all of the columns in between. So that's a pretty convenient one if you know what the first and last column are. So this is one way of doing it. And then there's also these tidy select functions, which you can use. Starts with, for instance, we'll select any column that starts with WK. So that's a convenient way in this category. And then you can also use matches, which is a regex. So in this case, I can be like even more specific. I can say any column that starts with WK, then has numerals after that, and then nothing after that. So this is a really explicit way of matching it with regex. So one other thing I wanted to mention about gather is that you can also, so I'm using key and value, but these are arbitrary. This can be anything. Technically, gather has these set as like default values, but it's kind of weird because the way this function is structured with the dots here, it actually doesn't matter what the default is because you always have to specify this. Otherwise, they would be picked up as something in the dots. So you always have to specify the key and value with gather. But we could set it to something more helpful than key and value. Like in this case, we could do week and rank. And in that case, then in our output, we have these last two columns. The week is the week that it's in, and the rank that's ranked. So that's probably more useful than just key and value. And why did I do this? Oh, and in some cases, I like to, I do this with a lot of functions, just to be more explicit. So when you're reading it later on, like here, if you're reading this quickly, you might have to remind yourself, oh, what is week? Is that the key or the value column? So I often put in this to be really, really clear about what I'm doing. So that's the basic functionality of gather. So now to kind of see how you would do this in Pivot Longer, which is the new version of this in tidyr. So the first main difference I wanted to point out is in gather, you can separately specify each of these columns that you want. So you would think maybe that you can do something like this, but it doesn't actually work. The way that Pivot Longer works is the first, well, technically the second argument is a columns argument, and it's only one argument. So you can't put in multiple things like this. You have to use one of these ways of specifying all the columns at once. So this syntax where you specify the first and the last column works with Pivot Longer, and also using the column ID numbers or negative ID numbers. And also these same tidy select things like matches works to select them. So the next interesting thing about Pivot Longer is that here I didn't specify the key and value names, this name and value. So the way Pivot Longer is structured, this actually works with it having a default value. So you don't actually have to specify name or value. The default will be name for the key column, or what gather calls the key column. Pivot Longer now calls name. And the values will default to value. But if you want to change it to something else, you can do as you did with gather. You can specify the names to column should be week, and the values to column equals rank. So now we end up with something very similar to what we had before with gather. One thing I forgot to mention about gather and these key and value columns as well. I've seen a lot of people do this where it's not a string literal, but it's actual like this object name. And I think this is rather confusing, but this will actually work. Or it used to. Okay, well, maybe not. Anyway, what to say, it used to work that you could put in like an object name here and gather would automatically determine like, well, this value, this variable doesn't actually exist, so I'll use that as the name.
It still worked.
It still worked?
They added it to the end.
Oh, yeah, right. It did work. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So I think that's rather confusing because this is not how, you know, if you look at this, if you're looking at someone else's code specifically and you see this, you might think like, oh, it's going to try and gather like all of these columns, key and value, but it's actually setting the names here. So I've trained myself to always be very explicit about this and always put this in quotation marks. So you know that that's a string literal. To me, that's more of an indication that this is not a variable name or a column name, but this is actual string literal that I want to name. And then this part here is being even more extremely specific about that. So this is why I suggest doing this, so it's really explicit what you're doing. So going back to this, we can do a very similar thing by setting the names column and the values column in pivot longer to achieve a very similar result. Now, some additional features that you can do in pivot longer that you couldn't do in gather, you could do by further processing in the chain, but not specifically in the gather function. Is one thing you can set this names prefix, and what this will do is it will tell pivot longer, once it makes this names column, the prefix is going to be what you see in the columns before it's pivoted longer. And if they all have a common prefix, like they do in this case, WK, if you set that here, then it will automatically remove that from the names column. So now instead of having week 1, week 2, week 3, we just have the number, which is probably closer to what we want because the WK is really redundant in this case when you get here. But you also might notice that this is a character, and that's probably not the most ideal thing because we have a numeric identifier of the week, and you might want to do some sort of logic with that. So character is not ideal in this case. So another feature of pivot longer is we can remove the prefix, but then we can also say for the names, we want the week column to be an integer. And then this will automatically switch you into this integer value for week, which is pretty nice. So that's pivoting longer and gather. I'm going to save that as billboard long, and then just use that billboard long as the example we'll use for spread and pivot wider, and basically try to get back to where we were before. So so we have this pivot long data frame now. And if we want to spread, you're telling spread which columns you want to take, which is the key column or the names column and the value column, and you want to spread them out into like further columns. So I think it's pretty simplistic. You just tell it those 2 column names and you spread them. And here I don't use string literal because these are actual columns that exist in billboard long. So I prefer then to actually use normal like tidyverse nomenclature by putting the object name of this in there rather than putting it as a string literal. So if we do spread, then we get close to what we had before, except that now we have these numbers as the column names, which is not what we had before. So one way you can deal with that with spread is using a separator. And if you put in a separator here, it will take the name of that column that you're spreading this week, adding and then affixing this separator and then the value. So what you get then is week_1, week_2. And this is pretty convenient. and it gets us closer to where we were before. I did want to point out that this might not be obvious, but separator is normally null. And if it's null, then it doesn't do this at all. But if you put a string, but with nothing in it, then it will still combine them, but it won't put a separator. So this is kind of closer to what we started with, except it's weak instead of WK. If we really wanted to get exactly the same thing, we could change the name of weak to WK first, and then spread with this null or with this blank separator. And now we're kind of back to where we were with WK1, WK2, etc. So pivot wider is pretty similar to spread. I think more similar than pivot longer is to gather. Yeah, so just like we're spreading weak and rank up here, we can do pivot wider with the names come from weak and the values come from rank. So we end up with this same thing, but with the numbers. And if we wanted to affix a prefix to that, we can use this names prefix, and we end up with the same thing that we started with. Now, one thing that I didn't mention at all, and I'm not going to because I want to stop now-ish, is that pivot wider and pivot longer. One really cool thing is they can spread and gather multiple columns at the same time, which means rather than ending up with something like this where you have weak and rank, you might have two sets of these. So you could have like weak rank and weak number or something. And this is something that's pretty fancy that gather and spread could not do, but that's for another session. So I've already passed my 15 minutes. I want to stop here and give some people some time to ask questions, or we just have a discussion. I'm interested to see if you've used these before or had trouble with these before, or yeah, anything you want to say, please go ahead and do it now.
Thanks, CJ.
We have still 10 minutes, so a lot of time. Thanks, CJ, for keeping the time. Questions?
I have a question. If you're trying to pivot longer on 2 or 3 columns with different types, will it try to coerce them to the same type, and will it give you a warning that you're trying to do so? So, for instance, in this Billboard data set, if you tried to pivot longer on week 1, then the date and the artist name, would it tell you like, oh, you're trying to combine a name, a date, and an integer?
Yeah, so I can't tell you the answer to that off the top of my head. And to be honest, I think it's complicated enough that like I have to think about these things for a few minutes before I could like answer that. But I know one advantage is in the past, if you were using gather and say in these columns that you're specifying that you want it to gather, if those are not the same type, what you end up with is one value column with all of those in it. And then those values would all have to be coerced to like the lowest common denominator possible.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Which means if you had a character and you had numbers, it would end up into one column of characters. And yeah, this is one of the biggest like downfalls of gather that can't be resolved, but that can be resolved with pivot longer. Yeah. So the way this happens with pivot longer, and this is exactly what I wasn't going to go into because it's kind of a large topic, but like really briefly, since you asked, what happens is these names to and values to arguments are very similar to like the are very similar to the key and value arguments of gather. However, these can actually be a vector of more than one thing. So what would happen is you would have either multiple values and names to or multiple values and values to, so that if you had two values in this values to argument, then you would end up with 2 value columns. And then well, I use the names p types, but there's also like a values p types, and you would list them in here. So it would look something like, So maybe like one value would be your rank, and that would be an integer. And the next thing would be like, I don't know, maybe like the name of the prize that they won for that. And that would be character. So in this case, you would end, well, I mean, this is very pseudocode. It wouldn't exactly work exactly.
Yeah.
But is essentially you would have, oh, and up here you would have to have like rank and
Prize. Yeah.
And what that would do is it would achieve exactly what what you were addressing, like when you have these multiple values that you want to spread. So you would arrange it so that the character ones end in prize in there. You also have to change how you specify this so that the right ones go into the proper values. Yeah, you have to tell it which ones go in rank and which one goes in prize, but essentially what you're asking is possible, is feasible.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, anyone else have a question or just general comment about spreading and gathering? I know it's an interesting topic.
I thought I used the names prefix thing once. I found it by chance, and I thought that was really useful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool.
That's my only comment.
Just a comment, maybe less on spread and gather, and pivot longer and pivot wider, but more on just the concepts of wide and long data in general. Yep. I know that like Mara and I, and when I was kind of first working in R, and before I was more confident in some of the kind of standards, I didn't realize that it seems like all of tidyverse is kind of accustomed or most well tuned to be handling long form data, just in general. And I don't know, I found that a helpful column, because I would be kind of constantly spreading and pivoting and pivoting longer and wider to do different things. And I didn't realize that, there's an entire algebra of functions that just kind of work well with long data, and you don't have to worry about swapping it so much. So that's just more of a comment if other people find that helpful.
Yeah, thanks. That's interesting. I think in some ways I totally agree with you, and then in some ways I totally feel the opposite. And then let me explain. A lot of dplyr is based on SQL language. And I think it's very natural in SQL to be in the long format. That's kind of how SQL conceptually is working. So for that reason, I think a lot of things in dplyr have this sort of like heritage based in this kind of working with long form data. But then over time, a lot of the functions now that dplyr work with are very natural to working with this like column-based data. So like if you say mutate is weeks divided by some value or something, this is very natural to do by doing just doing a mutate and then the actual equation with the variable names in it. That's very natural also for dplyr in some ways. So I feel like it kind of started with this heritage of everything should be long because that's how SQL works. And then over time, I think it's kind of converged more to like, okay, SQL is kind of like the underlying thing that's going on here, but a lot of the functions really deal with well with these data sets that are where the values are spread out across multiple columns. So I think it's a little bit, in some ways I totally agree with you, and other ways I think also has kind of moved in the other direction as well.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I also would like to suggest to everyone, there's a PDF, an article that Hadley wrote when he first wrote tidyr, that talks about tidyr and what it is, about tidy data and what it is. And I think this is the newer one. So there's one older PDF that he made, which is a little bit out of date in terms of like the names of the functions and stuff that he's talking about. But I think conceptually talking about tidy data is really, really awesome. So and I'll put the links in this at the top of this thing. And this link that's here at the top now, this is kind of a newer version where it talks more about like pivot wider and pivot longer. So both of those are not very long, but really worth it, I think, worth reading and understanding, because they really kind of explain these concepts well. So I'll put the original link at the top here, and then I'll also leave this link in here if you want to read those. I think it's totally worth taking a look at.
That's great. Yeah, I already included the PDF as a link in the resources section of the issue associated to this meetup. And I will absolutely add that link there as well to make it more visible for those who don't get, into the file. I think it's a good idea because, sometimes decisions feel a little arbitrary, and when you understand the underlying vision about, why things were developed one particular way, we are more kind of, I don't know, at least I feel more comfortable doing things, not just because, someone cool does it, but because, I understand why it works that way. And also, if you understand how their brains work, you can also somehow anticipate what later decisions they will make with the kind of entire ecosystem of tools. We have just 1 minute to wrap up. I don't know if anyone else, I have nothing to say, so I'll leave it to CJ or anyone in the audience here to close with whatever you want to say.
Thanks, CJ.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks,
guys.
CJ.
Thanks, CJ.
Thank you.
Thanks, clear.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Nice work on the scoping, by the way.